Welcome to our fifth video in the series on international macroeconomics. In this video, we're going to be studying the small open economy model we developed in the fourth video, and we're going to be computing certain comparative statics exercises. These exercises consist on checking what's going to happen to the economy when certain things change. The three things we're going to change are a change in current income, a change in the government spending, and a change in international interest rates. Let's go into the first one. So this is what happens when there is an increase in current income. And we can see this both in the algebra and in the graph. When there is an increase in current income, there is an increase in lifetime wealth. And as lifetime wealth increases, the budget constraint of the consumer is being pushed outwards. We can see this in the graph from the movement from the light blue line outwards to the dark blue line. This change in lifetime wealth generates an income effect for consumers. But importantly, interest rates do not change. R star is not affected because it is fixed by the international markets. And as a consequence, there is no moderating effect on top of the income effect that the consumers have. As a consequence, consumption is going to increase in both periods. We see that in the graph because the consumer is moving optimally from point A outwards towards point B. That's increasing both consumption in the future and consumption in the present. But if consumption is increasing, what does that imply for savings and the current account? Well, we can show that the change in consumption today is lower than the change in income today. That's because of consumption smoothing. If this didn't happen, the consumer wouldn't be able to consume more tomorrow. Now, what that's going to do, it is going to affect what changes in the current account by increasing savings. So as savings are increasing, so does the current account. The intuition is very simple. In order to increase future consumption, the agent saves part of the increase in output. That is what's increasing private savings. Now, as a consequence of this change, the current account increases, which means that if the consumer was originally saving, it is now saving more, and so it is exporting more. But if the consumer was originally borrowing, what's happening now is that the consumer is borrowing less, and so it is importing less. So what we know is that net exports go up. That doesn't necessarily mean that the consumer is exporting. Now at this point, a nice exercise for you to conduct on your own is to think of what's going to happen if there's an increase in future income. A hint for that is that an increase in future income is going to have the same effect on lifetime wealth, the same effect on interest rates because they don't change. So consumption should behave very similarly, but then the effects on savings and the current account are going to be different. Now on that note, we can revisit a topic we had briefly mentioned earlier in our second video, and it's the topic of current account deficits and whether they're a bad or a good thing. In that video, we had already mentioned that current account allows a country to smooth consumption, and now we can see a bit better what that means. When times are good and income is going up, there is an increase in the current account. The current account is helping the country to save in good times so that it doesn't have to consume all the bounty of the higher output, but it can actually save part of it. And similarly, when times are bad, when output is going down, then the current account is going to go down as well. And so it helps the country to soften the blow of the lower output by borrowing from abroad in bad times. So this is going to ultimately reduce the variance of consumption, which increases welfare. Without the possibility of running a deficit, if the current account was equal to zero always, consumption will have to be as volatile as output, and that's a bad thing for consumers. Okay, having said that, we can go now into our second exercise, which is an increase in government spending. So in this exercise, we're increasing government spending, and we can see how that's going to have an effect in reducing national savings. And because national savings are being reduced, the current account is going down. But let's do that in a bit more detail. Higher government spending today will increase the current account deficit. That's because there is a higher demand for goods that's reducing national savings. But the increase in government spending also affects consumers. Note that up here I didn't say how consumption was reacting. Well, it turns out that as the government spending goes up, taxes have to go up, which reduces lifetime wealth and reduces consumption. Now, this higher current account deficit is going to help consumers smooth the effect of the higher taxes. Basically, what's happening here is that even though consumption is going down, the change in consumption is lower than the change in government spending. That is why current account goes down even though consumption goes down and government spending goes up. The effect is not ambiguous. What's happening here is that the consumer is able to borrow from abroad to soften the blow of the higher taxes, being able in this way to smooth consumption. So it has to go down because of the higher taxes, but it can smooth out that shock by going and borrowing in international markets. Okay, the final shock, the final exercise we're going to do is an increase in the interest rate. Turns out that the effects of this increase are going to depend on whether the consumer is a borrower or a lender. To see this, we have to go back and think about substitution and income effects. The substitution effect here is straightforward. It is better to save when the interest rate is higher. So we know that consumption today is going to tend to go down and consumption tomorrow is going to tend to go up. This force alone is increasing savings, and so it's forcing the current account to go up. But there is an income effect that depends on the type of agent we have. For borrowers, an increase in the interest rate is a bad thing. It reduces their income, makes borrowing more expensive, and so consumption is going to go down. Now, in this case, both the income and the substitution effect go in the same direction, and so we know that the current account is going to go up for sure, because there are more savings. But lenders are benefited by having higher interest rates, and because of that, the effect on consumption, and so the effect on the current account is going to be ambiguous. We can see these a bit better, basically the way that the income and the substitution effect are coming together, when we look at an example. Let's look at it in the case of a borrower. The graph you're going to see now, it's for an agent that starts as a borrower. And so the borrower side of the budget constraint, here is the endowment point. And so a borrower is going to be consuming above the endowment point, and a saver is going to be consuming below the endowment point. And we can see that with respect to the initial budget constraint, the new budget constraint contracts. You see it moves inwards for the borrower, but it moves outwards for the saver. What we see here is that the substitution effect, this is the change from point A to point D in the light blue line, it's making consumption to go down. It is expensive to borrow relative than to save and have more consumption in the future. As a consequence, there is less consumption and more savings. Finally, the income effect, in this case from D to B, goes in the same direction. The decrease in the present value of wealth, it's forcing the agent to consume less. So in this case, the effect is not ambiguous. One last thing to see is that the effect is not ambiguous and the current account is going up because savings are going up. But that doesn't mean that savings have to be positive. In fact, this agent starts as a borrower and keeps being a borrower at the end. It's just borrowing less than it was borrowing at the beginning. So in terms of the current account, what we're seeing is that the deficit is closing, but it's not disappearing. With that, we finish our fifth video. We'll see in the next video how we can use this small open economy model to talk about default.